Well, it's the future conflict that, according to latest surveys, is bearing top of mind for many Australians. With war raging again in Europe a concern, it's the potential of conflict right on our doorstep between China and Taiwan, which is frightening Australians. But one Australian doesn't seem too fazed. Former New South Wales Premier and Foreign Minister Bob Carr. He wrote a piece in The Australian today calling for a cooling of tensions between the US and China, writing, "Talking up conflict is to talk up a showdown. That showdown carries a high likelihood of a US defeat. That increases the chance of US withdrawal from Asia." Joining us now are two of Peter's favourite columnists, with the Australian Jennifer Oriel and Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, Nick Cater. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Jennifer, let me start with you. Bob Carr has never been backwards in coming forwards with his opinions on China, and he's always been very supportive of Beijing. What do you make of his latest intervention?
Well, I think it's been remarked on more than one occasion that Carr's prose bears more than a passing resemblance to the official propaganda of the Chinese Communist Party. And some of the key points are that China is a victim of world affairs, even while it's, using neo-colonialist architecture, threatening its neighbours with annihilation, abusing the human rights of its own citizens, and so forth. The other is that the US is an imperialist force in the world, even though possibly no other nation is doing more to enact a new imperialist regime than China in concert with Russia. And of course, they've now signed a no hold bars, no sort of limits alliance at the time that just before Russia invaded Ukraine. Yep. So what we're seeing here is a defence of a horrifically autocratic regime that is expanding its military power to become second only in defence capability to the United States, and is vying for superpower status. You're choosing here between United States democracy, free world, universal human rights, and a liberal international order, and an autocratic militaristic regime intent on suppressing dissent wherever it finds it, and imposing its own rule over all others.
It's extremely curated commentary from Bob Carr. Bob's biggest targets, Nick, is what he calls the Dutton Doctrine, hyped up rhetoric, talking up conflict with China. But Dutton has only ever offered a real and truthful assessment of our new reality, hasn't he?
I think that's right. I think this idea of a Dutton Doctrine is rather overblown. I mean, I think Carr is right in saying we need to be circumspect towards China, and I think we have been. But I think where he goes wrong is to think that, it's the poking the panda theory.
Yeah.
That everything is our fault. And if China is reacting in the way it has been, that's because the US has been pushing its luck. Well, I just don't think that stands up to the test, does it, Chris? I mean, it's just not a proportionate reaction to the visit of a House Speaker to what is actually an independent state to start firing live missiles into the water off the coast of Taiwan and Japan. I think we have to recognise that China is potentially very dangerous. We need to encourage it to remain peaceful and not to campaign as it has been with this expansionist policy in the Pacific. And I think to the extent we have to stand up and be firm to that, yes, but certainly we shouldn't go provoking China, and I don't actually see that US or certainly Australia has been.
No. The conflict islands, I mentioned this at the beginning of the program, they lie just off Australia's east coast. They've caused a security concern this week over their potential sale to Chinese interests. The islands are strategically important. They could easily become a Navy and Air Force foothold, only 940 kilometres from Cairns. Jennifer, hopefully the name of these islands isn't taken literally. We need to move quickly on this, don't we?
Yes, I think the Australian government really needs a reality check on this. I see that Penny Wong has dismissed outright any notion of investment in those islands. But, we've seen what happens when power vacuums are created internationally. We saw what the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan created. And I think while we're all tired of overseas wars and Western interventionism, we do want to see an assertive policy that at least matches China's intentions and ambitions, especially for a territory so close to the Australian coast.
Yes.
And you've got to remember that a lot of current weaponry depends on access to deep sea waters, it depends on access to ports, and China's very good at creating a policy of encirclement, and we have to be very, very wary of that happening close to Australia, because once it happens, it's near impossible to turn back.
Yeah, Penny Wong underplays this at our peril, at our peril. Now, 81-year-old Dr. Anthony Fauci about to step down as the top medic, Nick. How will he be remembered? He was a divisive character through not necessarily the 80s and the 90s, but certainly through COVID.
He was an extraordinarily powerful figure in public health, not just in the United States, but around the world. He had that kind of influence. He was the father of the lockdown, essentially, I think, in the West. And I think for that, he deserves to go down with a very poor reputation. I mean, he was the one who argued for this. He was the one who argued against more selective support for the aged, for instance, or the vulnerable. He was the one who went out and rubbished and criticised people who came up with alternative forms of treatment. He was the one who stuck with the idea of the vaccines and the idea that they should be almost mandatory. So I think he's got a lot to answer for. Many of the things we now recognise as overkill and mistake started in his office and were driven by him and spread around the world. I think when the full story is written, he will come out of this very, very badly. And we haven't even mentioned his close connections with the pharmaceutical industry and, of course, the research lab in Wuhan.
Yes.
He's not, doesn't come out of this well.
The latter is something we can never forget. Adios, amigo, I say. Now, Jennifer, you've written about the cashless welfare card this week. We've discussed it at length on this program. I've spoken to Indigenous women, politicians, experts, community leaders. As you write, the card has been a success. What are we going to do when crime rates in these communities go through the roof again?
Well, we're going to hold Labor, the Greens and the selected independents who support the repeal of the legislation for the cashless debit card accountable. That's what we're going to do. One of the things that Labor's betting on is that we forget that they were responsible for taking away a system that prevents financial predation, that prevents people preying on mothers and fathers and depriving families of basic necessities like food, shelter and safety. We are going to hold Labor accountable for getting rid of an approach to welfare that potentially empowers Indigenous people to take hold of their own money and to protect it from that kind of predatory behaviour.
Yep.
And I think the other thing we need to remember is that alcohol-fuelled violence, drug addiction are the main causes of disadvantage in a lot of Aboriginal communities and non-Aboriginal, just very poor communities around the country. And if you don't have anything to control cash spend on those sorts of addictions, you end up with spiralling violence, intergenerational poverty and a lack of accountability from government for any of it. And it's completely unacceptable also to the Australian taxpayer that's throwing tens of billions a year into programs that aren't properly monitored and the government takes no responsibility for it. So we need to see Labor step up at this moment, not step back from their responsibility to help change outcomes for disadvantaged Australians.
We're heading in a very, very awful place with this, I tell you. And the same goes with the lifting of those alcohol restrictions in the Northern Territory where I've just been to. Nick Cater, Jennifer Oriel, I've run out of time, but thank you very much for yours tonight.